you see in AutoCAD?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So basically some of the things just kind of want to go over is the general setup of AutoCAD and some of the basic commands and just kind of a little bit of that detail. Like I mentioned, basically if you want to change the options related to like the crosshairs or the little pick box size, if you just type in options, enter, and then it pops up with this little box. So there's a couple things. So if you go to display, so I've got my crosshair size at 100, which goes all the way the full width of the screen. That's just my personal preference. That's just an idea.
What's the benefit of it? Just so you can see exactly how you're lined up across the entire drawing?
Well, so part of it is like, well, if it's small, to me, if it's smaller like where you're at, the way you had yours, once you get deep within, like, there's all these contour lines, there's all this other stuff, you kind of lose where you're at.
Right.
At least for me. And it's, again, it's a personal preference thing. If you go into drafting, you can change the size of the, what they call the aperture, the pick box. You just slide that left to right. And then the same thing for like the snap, the auto snap markers. And that just helps you, you know, get a better idea, maybe see it a little bit better. Again, these are just options, but just wanted you to see kind of how you can do that. Most of this other stuff, oh, see, there's the pick box size. You can make that a little bit bigger, and like the grips and stuff. So it's all just kind of in here under the options. Most of this other stuff you don't mess with, but that's kind of the main things, just those preferences. So yeah, my box is a little bit bigger now. So obviously you've seen kind of the general layout. You've probably noticed, like, if you're doing Civil 3D, you'll have this whole tool space over here. And this is where you can put like all the Civil 3D objects, which you shouldn't be working on. You know, if you bring in a external reference or a file, it may pop up with some surfaces. That's just kind of like a 3D elevation model, basically. And then just some of these other ones are more for like design.
So Tom told me to go up to the top where it says Civil 3D and just always stay on drafting and annotation.
Okay.
Is that right?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't. Okay, so I can do all the same stuff from here.
Yeah, so basically Civil 3D has more functionality. So I was wondering why yours looked weird. And maybe that's why it's easier to get the menus up here because there's not as much stuff. So obviously, yeah, you can change it to drafting and annotation. It's essentially the same thing.
It just has less options on drafting and annotation, right?
Yep. Yeah. But I would put it in Civil 3D because if you get a drawing from David, if you know, even the survey has Civil 3D objects that you may need to reference, or I don't know.
Okay.
That's my personal preference, but you know. So okay, let's see. So that's just something to keep in mind. I mean, you won't really need to worry about too much of this right now, or any of this right now, but just I would keep it Civil 3D.
Okay.
But most of your basic tools that you would have found if you really wanted to pick them from a menu is pretty much right here on the Home tab. So under Draw, this is all the basic kind of drawing functions. You know, you got line, arc, polyline, circles, rectangles, all that stuff. And then over here in Modify, you've got Move, Rotate, Trim, Copy, Mirror, all this stuff. So essentially, this is the bulk of everything you'll need to know, and that's what we're gonna just do, the shortcuts. You can always click, but to me it's just easier to do the shortcuts.
Right, because like this morning, I just started typing
Yeah.
until I need it popped up or
Yeah.
tried.
Yeah, and so it's just, and sometimes if you know the command, you know the name of the command, you just type it, and now that it's got that drop down box, you can generally find it. Um, and then we'll go through this in a minute, but this, the layer properties will be important. So pretty much everything you'll do will be in these toolboxes here, and all these other ones are pretty much not needed, except for maybe annotate, but we'll get there in a minute. So this is kind of probably how yours looks. Basically, the one thing which we went over yesterday, but one thing I just like to keep it standard and up all the time is the properties dialog box. And the shortcut for that is MO for some reason. I think you could type properties nowadays and get to the same thing, but MO, and then mine automatically docks over there because that's where I had it, but it'll probably pop out like this for you. And just a note, anytime you get a menu in AutoCAD that's kind of popped up like this, it's not like a normal Windows. You can't drag it from the top or anywhere. You have to click like on its like sidebar label. I know it's kind of weird, but then if you just drag it over and then you can kind of see that little line there, that means it wants to dock, and then you can adjust the size of it or whatever. But I like to keep this there because it always tells me what the current layer is right here and all the information about that layer. But then if you click on something, it automatically updates to what that is, which we'll see. So if you want to just, it's probably easier to just keep that docked and always there. So then it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So just a little bit about like just kind of the screen when you're looking at it. Basically, this lives in 2D space right now. So you see down here you've got kind of your XY. And so everything we type in, everything is an XY coordinate. And if you don't set any level of coordinates, then basically this point in the corner here is 0, 0. So 0 in the X direction, 0 in the Y direction. So everything you draw kind of has it's a grid, which I'll show you. Don't worry about if you hit F7 you can get this grid, but it's not useful. But basically that's kind of the grid in the single space. Some of the drawings, when we bring in surveys or stuff like that, it has a coordinate system attached to it. And so basically it knows, it's kind of like a latitude, longitude. I don't know if you've ever like heard of other coordinate systems or like georeference. Kind of like, I mean, on GPSs, you can set the coordinate system that you want it to be in, outside of just lat long. So there's ones that are for feet or meters, or most of what our surveyors use, which I'll kind of go back through this, but it's like Oklahoma State plane, and then you have to set a datum, which is basically the shape you think the world is, and then the coordinate system is based on what the numbers mean in the XY direction for the local area. So you generally use a state plane because it's more just local to your area. It's more exact. If you use a coordinate system that covers the whole Earth, it's not as exact as for a smaller area. But anyway, so I'll show you how to do that when we bring the survey in, but it's not necessary right now. So right now we just live in a 2D world where 1 in the X direction is the same as 1 in the Y direction. And so that's kind of all you have to worry about there. So let's see. So obviously you know kind of the basic line commands, and I'll just kind of reiterate some of what these are. So it's just L for line, but just kind of going back through, and this is the basic, we kind of touched on this yesterday, but going through each command. So once you say L, alright, now you can either obviously click on it or just hit enter, but then always basically read what it's telling you on the screen. So we know we want to draw a line, but then basically every command has multiple like subcommands built within it. You know, so it takes a few steps to get to each point. So here, obviously, we want to draw a line, so it's telling us to specify the first point. So we can move our mouse around and click somewhere, or if you see those numbers that are in those little boxes, that's the XY coordinates. Okay. And so you could say I want it at an exact coordinate, but for our purposes, we're just going to click here, so it specifies first point. So that's the beginning. And so now you see those boxes change. So it says specify the next point. So the box on top is the distance you want that thing to go, and the box on bottom is the angle. So we could tell it specific. We can either just click out here, and it's just like more random. We can kind of get it close, but it's hard to get it exact drawing it. But if we wanted a 50 foot, so we say 50 there, but then I think you have to push tab, and now we could say I want it at 45 degrees. You hit enter. Okay. Now you've got a line that's 50 feet long, or 50 units long at least, at a 45-degree angle. So obviously now, even though we've drawn our line, it's still asking us, we're still within the command. Okay, and so that's something to always keep in mind, whether you're in a command or not. And so it's wanting us to specify a next point, but say we don't want to. So we can either hit escape or just right click and then hit enter, like we're done. Okay, so that's kind of going through one command. Now again, there's multiple ways to select something in AutoCAD. We kind of talked about that yesterday, but obviously you can just pick it directly, which the good thing nowadays, it highlights itself, so you know you're kind of hovering over it. You just click it. Used to, you didn't know, you just clicked until you clicked it. So another thing, obviously, is the pick box. So we can draw to the left or to the right. And so again, if you go to the left, and this will just kind of become very natural and you'll get used to it, but if you go to the left, all you have to do is barely touch whatever object you want, and then it'll select it. Okay, but if you go to the right, you have to select the entire object. And so the reason that's useful is if you had a bunch of lines, say you have a bunch of lines, and say I want to pick this one but not all these other ones, I could come in here and say I only want that one, but that's the only one I can pick in its entirety, right? Because if you come in here and you just like, well, maybe you can get it, and sometimes it's easier to grab, but if you see what I mean. So
yeah, so you're holding on your index
sorry, yes, the left click button.
Yeah.
So you just click with your left, and so they've got a new thing now. If you just click once and then you click and then hold up, it'll draw a square or a rectangle basically. They have a new thing which to me is pretty unwieldy, but if you hold the left button down, so say I just wanted this, but I can draw like whatever shape I want. See what I mean? Like to select something. And same thing in the other direction. If you hold it down, to me it's really unwieldy because kind of drawing a line with a mouse is kind of hard. But say I just want to delete all of these, then I can just pick all those at once, and then I just hit delete. You can also, if you want to do it, I think just E is erase. So it's the same thing, but that's another option there. So yeah, so just click, and then so if you left click, that's basically what's going to happen. Obviously, we went through yesterday. So the little scroll wheel on the mouse, obviously, zoom in, zoom out, and then if you push it down, you pan over. Now, if you're really old school like that and don't understand how that mouse works. If you hit P for pan, then you can get to the guy and move over. Or you can hit Z for zoom, and you could zoom in. But obviously, that's never necessary anymore. Okay, so this is just a basic line. So if we click on it, now you see how our properties box changed. So obviously the nice thing with just a line, you can see it tells you the length and it'll tell you the angle. So again, this angle is relative to the way you drew it. Because we could draw a line. Let me do something real quick, just so we don't lose this one. So let's just draw a line, and don't worry, I'm just going to snap to the ends, but I'm starting at this angle and going down. But now if I click that line, still 50, but see what the angle is? So now it's 225 and 0. So these don't have bearings on them because we didn't tell it a bearing. In AutoCAD, it's not a bearing because it's using just 360 degrees. So in AutoCAD, basically straight to the right is 0 degrees. So east is 0, but then it goes counterclockwise. So east is 0, so we've set this at 45, so it goes 45, 90, 180, 270, 360, back to 0. So, but obviously if you think of it more in terms of, you know, your cardinal directions and bearings, so obviously this is 0, and then say this is 45 degrees, but basically think about like this is a quadrant. So that's north, east, west, south. So this is northeast, and it's quadrant 1. So we can either say this is 45 degrees and just leave it at that, or as a bearing, it's north 45 degrees east. Okay. So if we put it over here, it would either, so if we just, don't worry about, I'll show you how to do this in a second. No. So I basically just mirrored this over here. So it's still, now it's telling me the angle is 135 because we went 45, 90, 135. But this would be, in a bearing, it would be 45 degrees, but now it's north 45 west. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so, you know, some of this I'm sure you're probably familiar with, but just, so there's that. So just kind of, that's how we're going. And so this would be south, southwest, southeast, all that stuff. Okay. So just show you here quick a couple things about like drawing lines. So I'm just hit the line command, specify the first point. So see, normally we can just go whatever angle we want, but say you wanted to put it just exactly straight out. So we wanted to draw like a 90. So you could either type it in, or there's a button. So you either come down here and see it's kind of like a right angle. It's called ortho mode. You either click that or you hit F8, which I do. And now look at our options. It's either straight, east, south, you know. It can only go at 90-degree angles. And so sometimes that's helpful if you want to measure the angle, like say of a polyline or something, that you can draw a flat baseline to measure the angle relative to. So that's called ortho mode. And so you can draw like a perfectly flat line. Okay. So again, let's see. So if we're just doing line commands, we'll turn ortho off. So we said we could kind of keep just drawing line, you know, if you just keep drawing it, you could connect them back together. But see how, even though this is a connected object, so it's a polygon, each section is still its own line. Okay? So technically, if you're drawing one, you can just keep going around and it'll be the same line. But say I draw the polyline command, and I do the same thing, and I'm just snapping to all the corners. Now, the whole thing is a single polyline. Okay, and that's the benefit of, and the difference between the two, that lines, you can continue the command to keep drawing lines from the origin point of the last one, but they're all individual line segments. Whereas a polyline, when you do the same thing, it's basically just adding on to that line, and it's creating a single object. Now, it doesn't have to be all by itself. It doesn't have to close in on itself or anything. Okay, but so the benefit of using a polyline, so obviously, you know, you're looking at the right-of-way stuff. If you click on that line segment and you come over to the properties, you get the length and you get an angle, right? So obviously you're not going to get that in polyline because the whole thing's, but the new thing that pops up here is the area. Okay, so again, in this area will be based on the units of the thing. So this, you know, we're just in general units, so this is just squared, you know, units. Okay, and so that's the difference kind of in lines and polylines. But then also, you know, we talked about doing like the grip edits. And so the difference in using grips with a line, so you can see it just says stretch or lengthen. So you hover over the grip again, and you just kind of click it, and so you can move it around kind of as you want. And so that helps be able to move the actual vertices and things like that. But for a line, they give you 3 points, but you really can't do anything with the middle. You move the whole object if you grab the middle, right? And note that the middle grip of a line is still a square, okay? So you can move this grip, and then you could snap it to here. I've got the snap turned on. Or say you didn't want to mess with snaps. If you highlight this one too, see how now they're both grips. And so you can go grip to grip. Okay, and it's the same as a snap as long as they're both highlighted. Okay. So that's for lines, and essentially the polyline grips work about the same way, but you'll note here that you have the two kind of big squares on the end, but now you have more options. You can stretch, you can add a vertex, or you can remove a vertex. So in a polyline, the endpoints aren't seen as like a true endpoint of a segment. It's just the vertices within a bigger object. So now say I want to stretch that one. Well, it's connected to both ends, and so it stretches the whole object, if you see that. Okay, so obviously if I wanted to remove that vertex, now it's just connecting these two. Okay, but you notice the difference in the middle one, it's flat, so, but there's different options. So you can stretch it and move the whole segment up, same kind of as a line. We can add a vertex, which basically will change this point into a vertex, right? Or the other thing we can do, which is not necessarily you'll need to know, but you can convert it to an arc, which we haven't talked about, but now you can see how it's an arc function.
So what did you do to click on to just keep the snap on?
Okay, so alright, so that's something we'll get to in just a second. So we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we did the ortho, right? We clicked that button. Okay, so you can either hit F3 or click this thing down here. Alright, so you can basically turn it where the snapping is on all the time, right? And then within that, you can set which snaps are on all the time. So here's the list. So endpoint obviously is the end. The midpoint would be, you know, the middle of a segment. Center is like center of a circle. You don't really need that. Geometric center is the center of like an object. Quadrants, kind of the corners of a circle. Intersection's a good one sometimes. Perpendicular, sometimes you need to have that. Tangent, and then nearest, we've done that one where it's right, it's any point but it's on a line. So sometimes what I do, because I use endpoint pretty much all the time, that's kind of your main snap to go to. So what I do is within here, I just leave the endpoint one on, but that's the only one I leave on, because I want to show you, like, so if you had all these turned on, and you had your O snap on, so say I want to draw a line, see how like everything in the world is popping up, there's all kinds of options. Well, that kind of makes it hard to, you know what I mean, so you're trying to get the endpoint, but then the nearest thing keeps popping up, and you see how it's a little bit more difficult. So basically I like to turn everything off but endpoint, and again just F3 will turn it on or off, and that way you don't have to keep coming down here. Okay, but so if I just leave it on, then I can easily go here, 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 you know, so if you're doing it a bunch in a row, that's really easy, because the shift right click thing obviously is very slow. But say like I want a line, I want to start at this endpoint, but I want to go to this midpoint. It's like, well, I only need one midpoint every once in a while, so I'll shift right click, go to the midpoint, like, okay, now I can keep doing my thing. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's a personal preference. For what you're doing, basically, you know, you're doing just endpoints, so it's easier to just leave that on. So just click it on, and then just, you know, and it's easy to turn on or off if you don't want to use it. But that would be kind of how I'd go about it. You know, sometimes doing the shift right click is more, it just kind of slows you down, and so you're not just click, 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 click. You have to think about it. You have to kind of work through it a little bit more. But I know that it slows you down, and that's annoying. So, okay, so we've done the line and polyline and all that stuff. So we did selection. So let's just draw a few lines, and we're going to do kind of the trim and extend. And so again, and here's something, so we just drew a line. If you hit right click, and you can customize this, but this is kind of the standard, so if you right click, now it gives you kind of a menu. So the first option is always just to repeat the command you just did. And so you want to repeat line. But another nice thing is, if you're like, well, I use the same 3 commands all the time. So you can right click and go to recent input. And now it gives you, there's probably 10 or so. These are the most recent ones you just did. Okay, so you can always just kind of pick from one of those if you wanted to. And so, you know, there's that option. So a couple things, we did the trim command yesterday, so it's TR again. And so yours was a little bit different because it just lets you start trimming stuff, which is insane. But if you look here, this the old version. Basically, you have to select objects. So again, you basically, the objects you select are your kind of like cutting edges, and I think in yours that's what it called them. So you would need to hit like T to get to this part. But basically, we want to select the things we want to use to cut. So think about this as our knife. So say we want to cut the end off of this one. So we need to select this. So we selected our object, so we right click, and now it says select object to be trimmed. So now we can come up here, and you see how basically now this is using this as our knife to cut that off. Okay. So say we had two, so maybe we wanted to cut the middle out of this. So we trim, but we want to use these and this as scissors. So we can either trim the ends off one at a time, or see how now we can trim the middle off, but just between those two objects.
And you're right clicking the whole time.
Yeah, so basically, whenever you're in a command, and I guess we should have done that. So you type in, so enter and right click is basically the same thing. So just keep that in mind. So whenever you're doing it, whether you hit enter or right click, it basically amounts to the same thing. So I don't ever like pick from the menu because I know TR is what I want. So I just type TR, enter. Okay, and so basically to cycle through, every command again has multiple subcommands. So say we want to trim, so we select object, but now we're done with that subcommand. So we can either hit enter, which I just did, or right click, and that gets us to the next subcommand. Okay, and so now I trim that one. Okay, but that's all I wanted to trim, so I'm done. So I right click to finish that. So if you hit enter, obviously it's done. Or if you right click, you have to tell it to be enter. Sometimes you could do the same thing. You could just trim, right click, you trim that off and say I'm done, and you can just hit escape and it works the same way. You don't want to get in the habit of that. You want to get in the habit of hitting enter, because some commands, if you hit escape, it actually like undoes the command, but not all the time. So you want to get used to like just hitting enter and finishing out the command, basically. And so kind of another like example of that, and so this is something we discussed yesterday. It was a little bit confusing. So the move and the copy commands, so they basically operate exactly the same way. Oops. So you type M for move, okay, and so you hit enter, and so it's telling me to select the object. So I pick it and right click. Now it's saying specify the base point. So you can click anywhere you want, but say, and if we would just kind of want to move it out of the way, we just kind of pick anywhere close, and then just drag it. But you see how where we pick is the base point from which we move, so it moves relative to where we picked, right? So obviously, so if we want to move, if we click it and we're like way over here, you see how like we don't have as much like control, because we can zoom in, but we zoom in on where our cursor is, not where the object is.
Okay.
So you want to be able to have pretty good control. So even if you're just doing it relative, just kind of pick somewhere close. Then when you zoom and pan, see how it basically stays with your cursor, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the same thing, if we want to move an object, we can pick the base point to be an exact point, so like an endpoint. So we snap to the endpoint, but then we can also, now it's saying specify the second point. We could snap to another point and set it and dock it basically in an exact location. Okay, so you can do that same idea. And so when you move something, obviously though, this is a single event. So the command basically ends once you've moved it. Once you set that second point, you're kind of done with the command. So the copy command, it's CO, works essentially the same way. You have to select your object or objects, you specify the base point, and you move it, and you can set it somewhere else. But once you click, so I copied that one, it basically has just a repeat. You can keep copying this as many times as you want, and you just keep clicking. And so then you have to right click or hit escape to get out of that command. But again, you have to set the base point, and that's kind of, so if you're just generally moving something, you don't have to pick right on the line, or you just get somewhere close enough where you can see what's going on relative to your cursor. Okay. All right. I know this is probably boring. Do you have any questions?
Nope, not at all.
Okay. Do you have any questions as of this?
Not so far.
Okay. All right. So pretty much 90% of what you're going to be doing is lines and polylines. There's really not a whole lot of need to do other things. I will show you this real quick because it's basically the opposite of the trim command. It's the extend. So say we want this line to match up here, but at the same angle and everything. We could add the grip, but then trying to match that exactly perfectly, it's kind of difficult, and then to get it right on here. So we want to extend it. So EX, and this actually, so this time it's kind of backwards. So we're not selecting our knife, we're selecting the thing we want to extend it to. So not the object that we want to extend. We first pick the object where we want to go. And we click it, right click. Now we're telling it which object to take to that point. And then see how that just sends it on all the way there, but it hits it right exactly on there.
Okay.
So just to kind of show you maybe a few more of the snaps. So if you want to move like just this point, so say we wanted to put it on here, there's a couple ways. So we can extend it, but maybe that's not where we want it to go. So if we just highlight it, and then now we take the grip, and we can just move it around wherever we want. So we shift right click, and let's say we already showed you the midpoint. And you know the nearest. So obviously the nearest gives you this little hourglass, and it'll snap to anywhere along any line. Okay, so we could just snap it there. And now it's exactly on that line. But let me just drag it. Okay, so another option. So say maybe I want to put it right at the crossing point between those two. I shift right click, and I want intersection this time. So it'll pop up with a little X. And now that's the exact location those two lines cross. Okay, so that's another option. So the last one you probably would be helpful to know. So say I want it to be perpendicular. I want it to be a perfect 90 degrees with this line. So then you click the perpendicular there, and so now it makes a perfect 90 with this. Okay. Okay. Okay, and I guess the last one, which I know you're familiar with at this point, is the offset command, which is pretty useful. I use that pretty often. So again, that's just O for offset. And so there's a couple ways to do it. I told you don't generally highlight the object before you pick the command. You can do that. Like I just say I want to move that. So you hit move. Well, now you've already selected the object, but then now kind of the cycle is a little bit different as far as the way the command works.
Okay.
And so sometimes it's good to do that, and sometimes it kind of throws things off a little bit. So I generally like to just enter the command before I pick my object. Again, that's a personal preference thing, but So here, so I'll just show you here. So if I just hit offset, now the first option is what's the distance. So I type that in, it's 10. Now it tells me the object to offset, and then now I have to pick a side, okay? Whereas if I highlight it first and then go O for offset, it still asks the distance, but it already knows what I've got. So then now it's just what side do you want. But sometimes if you get used to doing it a certain way, you expect the next thing is to pick the object, right? And then you accidentally click, and anyway. So it's just, whatever you do, it's just better to do it the same way all the time, because then you kind of memorize the steps, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, because if you go back and forth, you think, okay, the next step is to select the object, but you've already selected the object, so then you click on what you think is that, and then it actually runs the command, and it screws everything up. Let's see. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is just like the measure commands. So again, there's a couple measure commands. There's ME. If you just type ME, you select the whole object to measure. You click on it, and then you can specify the length of the segment. So there, and then I don't know, that one never really works for me. Okay, so I always type MEA, so it's measure geom. Okay, so then it should give you an option. Now this is that other one, when you type that in your new AutoCAD, it was just like automatically giving you all of this when you like hover over stuff to me, which is another one of those that's a little too convenient, and it kind of makes things dangerous. So you can pick distance, all these things. So we're going to pick distance first, and then you just specify the points. So we go from here to here, and then it should pop up. So it's like 109.41. Okay. But let's say like we want to measure an angle, so like between these two. So we can select the arc, circle, or line, and the second line, and then now it's telling us the angle there. And then the other one you'll probably need to know is area. And so say, assuming there was a line here, and you just basically click all the points around, and you just kind of draw your polygon. And then when you're done, you just right click, enter, and then here it'll tell you the area and the perimeter. Okay, and then it'll just kind of keep going, so you have to hit exit. Within that, so say I wanted to, so these are just lines, but I wanted to get the length of both of them at the same time. So you see how if you click both of them, your properties goes to nothing, because for the geometry, since they're individual things, the length will be, it just says varies. Now, if this was a polyline, kind of the same thing. Now again, it's a single unit, so now it does have a length, right? But say we want both of these together. So you do the MEA, and we want D for distance. But see, it says specify the first point. So we did that, but then if you look at the down here, it says specify the second point or multiple points. Well, we want to go from here to here, so we're going to need more than one point. So we hit M for multiple points. So that's something, if you ever look, when you're looking down here, it'll generally give you options. And so even the options for when you said distance, radius, anytime there's a capital letter, that's kind of like the shortcut code. That's
Okay.
So here we can either specify the second point, or it just says multiple points. But you see there's a capital letter, so you can either click here, or you see how the M is capital and blue. We just hit M, type M, and hit enter, and now it's going to allow us to do multiple points. So we click, and then right click, and now it's the full distance of those 2 points. Okay, but you see how on this menu, that's why I was hitting D for distance, not just because it's spelled that way, but because that's a capital. So here you would hit A for angle, but AR for area. Okay.
Okay.
And if you want to do X for exit. Alright, so that's something as far as like when you're in a command, if you ever see that there's options, basically the capital letters are the ones, like the shortcut kind of codes to get there. So we kind of went through this yesterday, but say you were wanting to draw, so we'll go back to just the line command. So say we started here, and again we have these options. So we want a line that's 50, and we hit tab, and then we want it 45 degrees. Enter. Okay. So we have a line that's 50 long and 45 degrees. So again, let's say we want to put that same 45 over here. So we either have to remember that a 45 this way is 50 tab at 135, or we can actually do it as a bearing. And so that's where you can say, I want a line. It's the same command. You still specify the first point, but then there's a shortcut like subcode to do bearing and distance, and it's apostrophe BD. You have to click your first point first, and then you hit apostrophe BD and hit enter, and now it gives you this whole separate menu. So now you can say which quadrant you want it in. So say we want to do a southwest this time. So you can see how it cycles through. So quadrant 1, you can either click it or you have to specify the number. So 1 is northeast. So this is what's really annoying here. Okay. Even though AutoCAD, this is 0, that's 45, that's 90, this is 135. So it adds degrees in a counterclockwise manner, right? The quadrants are numbered in a clockwise manner, just to make things difficult. So you just need to see like what it's labeled. But we want the southwest, so it's quadrant 3, so we just say 3, right? Or click it there. And so now it's asking for the bearing. So we want a 45 degree bearing. So we just type 45, and then now the distance is 50. Hit enter. Okay, so now we have that there. So it's either angle 225 or it's bearing south 45 west. So that's one way to draw, and that's the YouTube video I did have posted basically goes through that. And so that's kind of what, if you ever have to draw in, instead of just highlighting, you know, say you're highlighting the center line or the section line in the right of way, you would have to actually draw it in at that bearing. That's how you have to draw it, or you have to write it. So again, that was just line, enter, you specify the first point, and then apostrophe BD. You pick your quadrant, so you can just click on one, and then it says specify bearing. So you know, so if you wanted to do the full thing, you could say 45 D 0 minutes 0 seconds, and then the distance 50. Okay, and then but see how you're still in this command, so you can either hit escape, but see how you escaped the bearing and distance like subcommand, but you're still in the line command, so you'd have to hit escape again or enter again to get out of it. So there's that. So, and another option, well, that's not worth telling you. Okay. So the last one, which I'll just kind of show you, there's a couple things as far as like what they call annotating, or kind of making text, or dimensioning and stuff. the quickest way to put text on here is just to type text. And you hit enter, and so it tells you that a start point, and then a height, which sometimes you just kind of have to mess with. So you just right click the default, and then it's the rotation angle. So you could put it on an angle, but we don't need to do that right now. But that shows me, and then so we'll just say 0, so that means it's just going to go left to right. Enter, and so now it's got like a little text window, and so we'll just, right. But sometimes, watch it, when I hit enter, see how it went really small. So here I'll show you a few more commands. So a text thing, so it only has one grip. So you could grab that grip and move it around or do whatever, or you could hit the move command. So we want to make this bigger because that's obviously, say it's too small. So if we go to our properties box, you can see here there's a couple options. So there's rotation angle, height, justification, all these things. But let's just change the height to 5 because it was 0.8. And so okay, now that's a decent size there. So we could rotate it 45 like that. There's another way, another tool, which I don't know how much you'll need to use right now, but just another common one, which is rotate. And so it's RO, and you hit enter. And so then you select the objects, right click, and then here's where the base point kind of really matters, because that's going to be like the center point at which you're rotating something. So if we just kind of want to rotate this whole thing, it'd probably be good to just kind of click about here, and now see how we can rotate. So we could set, and it's asking for a rotation angle, so we could say 45, and it does kind of the same thing. But I want to show you, so if you do a weird base point for your rotation, say let's just do it up here, now see how it's rotating. It's kind of like around, like a merry-go-round center. Okay, so that's why like specifying the base point sometimes like really matters. So that's kind of the main thing. I don't think we need to get into multi-line text yet, but so there's another, so text here, this is single line text. So if you hit enter, that it ends the command. We're done. So if you wanted multiple lines of this text, you'd have to copy this. You see what I mean here?
Okay.
There's another command, this multi-line text versus single line. Multi-line text, then you can basically say, here's a box that I'm writing stuff in. And then you actually have to hit escape to get out of that. But now this is all a single object, right? Whereas if I did this single line text, the same thing, so it will let me do this same, it looks like it's doing the same thing, right? But then I hit enter and then escape. Each one of these is an individual object in single line text. You can type it that way from the beginning, whereas this is a single object, like a paragraph basically, that you can edit that way. So you just kind of have to pay attention to how it's like clicking, so especially like when you get stuff from Dad, or because most of the time Dad doesn't ever use multi-line text. It just depends on whether you need it or not, but I don't think he ever uses it. So you have to, if you're writing a paragraph, then you have to do it one line at a time, which gets old. Okay, so let's see. Let me think. So I think the next main thing we need to do, just as far as basic AutoCAD stuff, is go into the layers and just talk about layers for a minute. So if you click the layer properties box, this is what you get. And just kind of make that where you can see it. Okay, so each layer basically has all kind of different things. And so these are like the defaults. Pretty much it always comes in here. And so this is for Civil 3D. You probably aren't going to see all these if you're doing drafting and stuff. But basically they all have kind of a 0, it starts on 0, but there's A, C, and then there was like V down here. So the V stands for like survey. I don't know why, but so it's kind of, this is a survey layer. C is a construction layer. And then I think the A is for like an architectural layer. You can put anything on anything. But yeah. Thank you for that, Bubba. And so there's, there's a bunch of these pre-built in, so you can use whatever, but the main one of the things you want to do is be able to put things on different layers so you can turn them on and off independently. Because sometimes things get really bogged down or confusing, and so, or you want to clean up the drawing a little bit, like you needed a lot of that stuff in the background while you were doing it, but you don't want to print it that way. So there's some options for turning things off. So there's on or off, which is just this light bulb. You can click it and see now it's a dark light bulb. You can freeze the layer, so it's a snowflake or a sunshine, or you can lock the layer. So let me just switch layers real quick to just show you. We'll draw a few lines in different layers. So again, so say I wanted to freeze a layer, and freezing layers and turning them off are kind of the same thing. I generally go with freezing the layer because it both makes it disappear and you can't really do anything with it. But for reference, so let's just say we go up to this box, and so we go to the snowflake. So we want to freeze a layer. And we just pick this one. Okay, it's the current layer. Let's do this one. So you can't ever freeze or turn off the current layer because that doesn't make sense. So we click this one and they just disappear. Alright, so they kind of go away because we froze them. So the same thing if we like turn them off, they'll just disappear. So for all intents and purposes, that's kind of the same thing. I generally defer to freezing because freezing just makes it like disappear, but it doesn't like turn off its functionality. So like if you ever have like your right away your survey drawing or something, if you turn off a layer that was like doing something in the background, then it kind of changes things. So always just use like freeze, and then that'll just clean your drawing up a little bit.
So on the lines of that, let's say that I have this center line, and I'm wanting to come, the 24.75 off of that to actually see where, where the statutory right of way ends. But let's say that I'm drawing a line out, for instance, like the one that I'm already working on already has a statutory right of way.
Yeah.
When I draw a line over that one, and then I make my right of way box, when I go to delete that line from the survey point over, well, it's not going to delete both lines. It's just going to delete the top line that I put over, correct?
Yeah, so if you draw like a bunch of lines on top of each other, and you just click, if you do this, that's everything. If you just pick one at a time, delete it, that other one's still there.
Okay.
But if you did this, now everything goes away.
Okay.
And so again, and that goes back to, so when you're just clicking, try not to ever just click, because every time you hit the left button, you're drawing a window. I know that it gets kind of, you get used to like Microsoft Word, you just kind of click and you just, But here that causes a lot of consequences, because again, once you click something, you may not even realize you clicked it, and you're clicking here, and you're wondering why you can't see anything. It's because you have multiple things selected. But also, if you start doing this, you're in the middle of a command, and so again, you can't do anything while you're in a command. So you always just have to escape. So I get in the habit before I even unless I can see this perfect box, I just kind of hit escape before I do stuff, just to make sure there's nothing active going on. So again, like say, if we freeze this layer, so the nice thing is you can freeze layers one at a time, right? That goes away. But you can't thaw layers one at a time. You can only thaw all layers. Now, for our purposes, there's only two. But remember yesterday when I thawed all those ones, and then all that purple lines came up and it looked really crazy. So you don't want to do that. But you say, well, how am I supposed to get this back? So you go to the layer properties, and we'll go find that. So you could actually search. So let's say freeze, you can sort by all the layers that are either sunny or frozen. And so it's just that one layer that's frozen. So you just click on there, that one, and now it's back on.
Okay.
So I don't ever really use this box that much, but I just use that little thing. But what I would do, something for you to be helpful so you don't clutter things up, is what I like to do is every single, so I guess on yours, somebody owns everything on the north and west side, and then the airport owns the southeast side, right?
Right.
Okay. So that way, like your north, south, east, west, they're different right-of-ways. What I like to do is for every box I draw that it's going to need a description, I like to create its own right-of-way layer. So you have multiple cross drains that you need to do. So I would make a right-of-way layer. And so again, if you're in the layer properties, you go up to this, I don't know, like little orange ball one, and it's a new layer. And so you can create it, and then so what I would do is say like, all right, it's cross drain 1, and then say like west side of the road right away, something like that. And then you can change it to whatever color you want here. I mean, just kind of stick with the basic ones. I don't know. So let's just say green. Okay. So here, there's all these little rhombuses or whatever. If you double click that and it's a green check mark, that means that's the current layer. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that unless the layer is current, anything you make is not in that layer. So you need to change back and forth between layers. So let's say we want to draw a right-of-way in this layer. And so now, and this is why it's nice to have the properties box. So now we know 2 places. We can look up here, and that tells us the current layer, which is our right-of-way. And that didn't update, but so okay, it did update. It just took a minute. So we should have 2 places where we can see what the current layer is. So let's just say we did our right-of-way, do something like this. Okay, and we drew it and we measured it out, but now it's kind of cluttering things up. What we can do, let's just switch layers, and then we can just freeze that layer, so now it's out of the way. And then we can make a new layer for the east side, and a new layer for cross drain 2 west, a new layer, and then that way we keep them organized about which is which, and so you can kind of clean them up as you're going, so you don't just have all this stuff everywhere. But then you know, all right, now I want to go back in and measure that one cross drain layer. So I'm going to unfreeze that, and then come back to it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, and it's just a cleaner way of kind of going about doing that. And then that way you never get confused. You shouldn't get confused when you're trying to like measure, like, well, wait, which one was what? So it should be the only one popped up, because you can go through, and so you've got cross strain 1 west, cross strain 1 east, cross strain 2, cross strain 3, 4, 5, whatever. And that way it's all kind of neat and tidy, and so you can turn them on and off as you go. So, okay, so there's that. I think that's pretty much the basics, at least, of AutoCAD. The basic kind of